Magic numbers and acronyms are memory hacks that can help you learn and memorize. In this video, I'm going to show you how to organize new information using magic numbers 3, 2, and 1 and acronyms like NBA, NFL, TLC to help learn and memorize based on science. And I'll demonstrate with a real-world example. First, let's talk about magic numbers. And when I say magic numbers, I'm talking about the numbers 3, 2, and 1, grouping information into chunks of 3, 2, or 1 items. The concept of magical numbers was formulated by Professor George Miller, who was a psychology professor at Harvard. He published a classic article with the title, "The Magical Number 7 Plus or Minus 2, Some Limits on Our Capacity for Processing Information." Professor Miller argued that our brain has a limit on the number of items that it can process. And he chose the number 7 plus or minus 2. That's probably partly the reason why phone numbers are 7 digits. But phone numbers are actually 10 digits. It's area code 3 plus 7, so it's actually 10. So here is a copy of the article published in the Psychological Review, 1956, George Miller, psychology professor at Harvard. So our brain has two types of memory, long-term and short-term. When we're reading and trying to learn new information, we're using short-term working memory. Now, one of the features of short-term memory is it has very limited capacity. And Miller was saying 7 is the upper limit of that capacity. Now, if you think about trying to memorize new information, like numbers, for example, one item is very easy. 2 is not too bad. 3 is a comfort zone. From my own experience, and you can test it out for yourself, once you get to 4 or higher, things start to break down. So let's think about a phone number. A phone number is actually 10 digits, has 3-digit area code, then the next middle part, that's 3 digits, and then it's 4. So 10 is broken down into 3, 3, and then 4. And this is a manifestation of this magical number 7. Now I say the magic number for memorization is 3, 2, or 1, 3 or less. The brain likes to, once you get to 4, you need to break it down into 3, 2, or 1. Now it varies from a person to person. Some people can memorize larger chunks at a time, but the 7 is the average, and he says plus or minus 2, which is 5. But let me show you what to do when you get to higher numbers. So I'm going to use a 4, but you could also apply this with 5. When you get to 4, you always want to break it down into 3, 2, or 1. So here's an example of 1019. But when you looked at it, did you say 1019? That's 4 digits. It's actually easier to remember if you break it down into 2 parts, 1019. So 1019, 1019. 1019 is more fluid. You could also do, so that's 2, that 1019 is split into 2 parts. 1019. You could also split into 1019. So this is an example of how to break down 4 into 2 parts. 2020 is another example. 2020 is actually 2020. 2020 is a lot easier to remember. What about 5,000? 5,000 is actually 4 digits, 5000. But it's conveniently grouped into 1. So when you get 4 or higher, you want to break it down into 3, 2, or 1. So 5,000 is a great example. Perfect, easy to remember. 5,000 is just one number. 20, 20, that's easy. That's 2, 20 and 20. And it repeats. So that's why, ideally, if you can reduce it to 1, that's the best. 2 is pretty comfortable. So breaking things down to 2 is a really comfortable thing. 3 is about 3 is in the comfort zone. 4, that's when you need to start grouping into smaller chunks, 3, 2, and 1. So when I talk about chunking, now what I'm trying to say is when you have new information, you have to organize. Organizing is basically creating lists, organizing information. If you can organize the information into lists. Lists using the magic numbers of 3, 2, and 1. Basically, you want to organize or group information into chunks of 3, 2, or 1. So this is a good time to look at mind maps, which are a good representation of how the brain likes to work. Basically, with a mind map, you have these circles with lines that connect the circles. So, for example, in the central circle is connecting to all the surrounding circles, and there's a line. So if you think about it, that's how a list operates. So if I say, hey, top 3 foods are pizza, cake, and French fries. So top 3 is the header. That's the top tier level of information. And then the 3 are lower level categories underneath the top 3 foods. And then they're linked by this category of top 3. So basically what you're looking for are keywords and concepts, and then a connection with those keywords and concepts. So the 2 parts of any mind map are the circles, which are actually nodes. They could be squares, nodes or anchors, or keywords or key concepts, and then the connection to each other. If they're not connected, then there's not a connection. That would be 2 different mind maps. So that leads me to acronyms. That's the second part of the memory hack. Acronyms are when you take multitude of words, like a group of items, and then you group it into one word, usually with the first letter. So that's always look to do the first letter, because when you have a list, the eye is going to gravitate to the first. In general, the brain tends to memorize the first and the last items of the list the best. When you're making an acronym, it's best to use what they call the initial letter or initialism, or the first letters. So examples of acronym are NBA, NFL, NASA. And if you think about it, all the sports leagues have acronyms. MLB is baseball, NHL is hockey, FIFA, soccer, MLS, soccer, and a lot of government agencies, all government agencies have acronyms. And this makes things easier to remember. So NASA is actually National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Which would you rather memorize, NASA or National Aeronautics and Space Administration? Well, of course, NASA. But once you know NASA, it's easier to remember National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Also, in the long term, it's a lot easier to recall. It's like, oh, okay, NASA, and then you go NASA. So acronyms are actually lists of related items. National Aeronautics and Space Administration. It's actually, the NASA represents the 4 items on there. Now NASA is actually, you're like, okay, well NASA is 4. However, how do we pronounce it? We break it down to 2 syllables, na and saw. So if you look for these patterns here, 3, 2, and 1, 3, 2, and 1 come up a lot. 4, if you really analyze things, many times when you memorize things, you'll see, okay, well NASA's 4. No, it's actually 2, na and saw. Now the thing about the short-term working memory is there's a visual component, and there's also an acoustic component. So think about this. When you're trying to memorize, let's say someone says, hey, let me give you my phone number, and you don't have your phone with you to record the number, and you have to put it into your brain. That's memorizing phone numbers will you memorizing new numbers will give you an example of how the magic number thing comes up. And so by combining the magic numbers, 3, 2, and 1, and using acronyms to help memorize lists, so you want to make a list of related information, which is actually a form of, a list is a mind map. Well, it's a vertical mind map. Using these two things, this is how you can memorize the information. So let me demonstrate with a real world example. So this is from an actual college textbook, Principles of Management. And this is a section on the roles that managers play. So managers play so many roles within an organization. So the way they grouped it is roles that managers play. So roles is at the top tier of the information, of this information that we're trying to process here. Roles, and then what's roles? It's 1. Roles of manager. That's one item. At the next level, they've organized it as informational, interpersonal, and decisional. That's 3. So how do we need to memorize this? Well, this is what I'm proposing because I played around with it. Okay, so informational, it's interpersonal, but actually the key word there is personal. It's in between people. Interpersonal, information, person, and decision. So DIP. Especially when you have a vowel, that's really helpful. So you could do PID, which is easier to remember. PID, which is 3 letters, or DIP, 1. You always want to try to reduce to 1, so DIP. DIP stands for decision, information, and personal, which is actually interpersonal. We already memorized it. So now let's backtrack. If we're doing a so what do we do here? So we have role at the top, role of managers, and this can be easily made into a mind map. And then there's 3 parts to it, which is DIP. DIP, decision, information, and personal, and person, which is actually interpersonal. And notice how I simplified it. Instead of decisional, I just said decision. So it's always trying to reduce things as much as possible. Ultimately, 1 letter is the reduction. So you got role of manager, top tier, that's 1 item. Then we got 3 items. But then I made an acronym called DIP, which DIP is 1 sound. So again, the short-term working memory works with sound and with visual. So the 2 alternatives were DIP versus DIP. DIP, it's pretty good, but DIP is even better because it's 1. Ultimately, if you can reduce it to 1, that's the best. Less is better. So then DIP stands for decision, which is a shortened version of decisional. Information, which is shortened from informational. And then person, which is short for interpersonal. All right, so that's one example. So now going to the next tier here, let's look at informational. Okay, informational. So informational has monitor, disseminator, and spokesperson. Well, there's actually one that popped out really immediately to me. That's MDs, medical doctors. So we have informational. We're talking about informational roles. Here, let me do an indentation here. Informational. And I've actually reduced it to 1, MDs. Just think medical doctors. Informational, MDs. Okay, what's MDs? That's monitor, disseminate, and spokesperson. So again, I keep trying to reduce it to if I can, to smaller and smaller numbers. So let me do another example here. So interpersonal is figurehead, leader, liaison. I would probably do LLF, FLL, FLL, a little bit hard to pronounce. Lead, liaise, figure. Okay, actually, lead, liaise, figure. Okay, what I'll do here is this. I'm going to go based on a sound, and I'm going to try to group it all into one. Because again, short-term work in memory works with sound and visual. If you can make one sound, it's not just about words, making one sound. So I'm going to go lead, liaise. Sometimes it's an acronym, sometimes it's one sound, figure. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually make it into one sound. Lead, liaise, figure. Lead, liaise, figure. LLF. Lead, liaise, figure. So lead, liaise, figure. So I converted that into one sound. Now, decisional has entrepreneur, disturbance handler, and resource allocator. So how am I going to figure that out? Okay, so this is what I did here. So decisional, I'm going to group it into, it's 4 items. I'm going to group it into, I'm going to split it into 2 parts. And that's going to be ED and RN. ED-RN. Okay, what is this acronym? ED, Emergency Department, RN. So I can visualize this. So now I can visualize this. In the emergency department is a registered nurse, RN. Or Ed, and his name is Ed. So Ed, the RN. Emergency department, RN, Ed, the RN. So it's an imagery, but also can you make a story out of it? So there is a nurse, RN, named Ed, and he works in the emergency department, ED. Perfect, we got it. ED, 2 parts, RN. And ED stands for entrepreneur, disturbance handler, resource allocator, and negotiator. But you need to constantly go through. Now, here's the thing with the mind maps. You have the levels, but what I like to do is kind of go vertically and go levels up and down. So people like to draw the mind maps, but in terms of repeating when I'm communicating to somebody. So mind maps are a visual representation, but when you're communicating, usually go in layers or tiers. So if I was to talk to somebody and say, hey, what's this all about? Well, this book is about managers. This particular section is about roles of managers. There's 3 roles. Notice how I'm going level by level. There's 3 roles: DIP, decisional, informational, and personal, or interpersonal. Next level, informational, MDs. 1 sound, 1 word, medical doctors, okay, which actually fits in with the acronym, the mnemonic for decisional. MDs, MDS, monitor, disseminator, spokesperson. Number 2, role, person, personal, interpersonal, LLF, lead, liaise, figure. Not the best, but it's the best I got. Lead, liaise, figure, LLF, lead, liaise, and figure. You can imagine those are all actions. Lead, liaise. A leader will liaise, that will connect with, talk to people, different groups, and then figure out what's going on. Okay, I just created a story. It helps to create a story. So a leader will liaise or liaison with different groups and figure out how to make it work together. There we go. We just created a story. That one story is imagery, but it's also one story. So that's figurehead, lead, leader, liaison, figure. So the mnemonic also kind of plays on words. Then we come up with decisional, using the medical theme here. To bounce back to interpersonal, we could say, hey, this is at a hospital. They have different departments. So the leader of the hospital, the CEO, has to liaise with the different departments and figure out how to make them all work together. So we'll use a hospital theme to unite it all. One. Okay? Let's go back down to decisional. Decisional. Again, hospital theme. Ed, the nurse, RN, works in the emergency department. So Ed, RN. Entrepreneur, disturbance, resource allocator, negotiator. So the reason why I like to do it in layers or levels is because when I'm explaining this to someone else or talking to somebody else, that's how the information is going to be done in sequence. The mind map helps with visualization. Now, again, the short-term working memory has a visual component and a sound component. So this is good if I'm drawing this with somebody, but if someone came to me and I'm trying to explain things to somebody, the mind map is nice conceptually, but the reality is you're going to speak in levels and layers. So this represents how, if I were to explain to do a PowerPoint presentation, or if I became a teacher and I'm teaching from this book, how do I communicate this information? And actually, this is exactly how I would communicate the information. And then the people would say, oh, okay, this makes sense. I actually would present this information in this manner with these mnemonics. Because if I'm a teacher, I want them to learn and remember this new information. And the good teachers will do that. They'll go step by step and they'll go by layers, always maintaining the context and then the connections and the key words. So 2 things to remember: magic number 3, 2, and 1, and acronyms like NBA, NFL, and NASA.